Louisiana, 1874. The summer heat pressed down like a curse. The air was thick with the hum of cicadas and the slow breath of the bayou. From the distance came the croak of a bullfrog, deep and hollow like something calling from beneath the earth. Belmire, a settlement along the muddy banks of the Teche River, had always been a quiet place, until she arrived. Margaret Holloway stepped off the steamboat with nothing more than a black trunk and a letter of recommendation from her late husband's attorney in New Orleans. To the people of Belmire, she was a figure of fascination, a widow too young, too beautiful, and far too composed for someone who had buried a man only months before. Her mourning dress hung perfectly against her frame, a portrait of dignity and restraint. But what captivated the townspeople most wasn't her beauty. It was her smile. A small, polite upturn of the lips that never quite reached her eyes. In a town where gossip traveled faster than the river's current, stories about Margaret grew before she even settled in. Some said she came for money. Others whispered that she drained her husband's fortune before he died. No one knew for certain, and she never corrected them. She just smiled, thanked them for their kindness, and went on her way, as if she had all the time in the world. Margaret rented a 2-room house near the edge of town, shaded by live oaks draped with moss. From her porch, she could see the spire of the small Catholic church, the fields where the men harvested cane, and the endless green murk of the swamp beyond. She began her new life there, quietly, efficiently, almost gracefully. Within weeks, she was teaching the local children etiquette and penmanship, her charm and poise earning her the trust of nearly every family in Belmire. But it was her visits to the sick that made her beloved. Margaret often arrived at their homes with baskets of soup, linens, and medicine. The priest called her a gift of Providence. Yet for some reason, when she entered a sick room, the lantern light always seemed to dim, and the air turned colder. The first death came in July. Lucille Bro, a seamstress known for her sharp tongue, fell suddenly ill after tea with Mrs. Holloway. Within a day she was gone, and the cause was declared fever and exhaustion. It being Louisiana in the heat of summer, few questioned it. Margaret attended the funeral wearing her black lace veil, standing silently beside the coffin. Witnesses said she smiled faintly as the casket was lowered, as if comforting herself with some private thought. Soon after, she began visiting the widower, offering comfort. Within 2 weeks, his grief softened under her company. And then, just as tongues began to wag about the propriety of their meetings, he too fell sick. The doctor called it a stomach ailment. He was dead by dawn. Margaret was seen the next morning, still in mourning black, bringing him flowers. The pattern might have gone unnoticed, if not for Reverend Dunn. He was an observant man, slow to judge, but troubled by the calmness that surrounded Mrs. Holloway. "That smile of hers," he once said to the midwife, "it never fades, no matter how the world trembles." He started keeping quiet notes in his ledger, names, dates, strange coincidences. But Belmire was not a place that liked its peace disturbed. The town's women admired Margaret, and the men found her presence disarming. She hosted teas, organized charity work, and even helped nurse the sheriff's wife during childbirth. An angel in widow's black, the judge's wife called her. By autumn, every door in Belmire opened for her. She was loved, trusted, and feared, though no one could yet explain why. There were patterns, subtle but clear. Those who opposed her, who crossed her in business or gossip, seemed to fall ill. A merchant accused her of overcharging him for imported lace. He was found dead in his store that winter, half-finished ledger open beside him. The doctor gave his usual verdict, fever. Margaret helped arrange the funeral, paid for the flowers herself, and ensured the widow received half the merchant's remaining stock. Her generosity was stunning, her smile perfect. The truth, however, began to seep through like water through floorboards. It came from whispers in the tavern, small remarks carried on the humid night air. "Everybody she touches dies," someone said. A young farmhand claimed he'd seen her in the cemetery late one night, standing by a grave long after the gates were locked. The next morning, he told his story to the barkeep, and 2 days later, he drowned in the bayou. The sheriff ruled it an accident. Margaret brought lilies to his mother. By Christmas, fear had quietly settled over Belle Meyer. The children still curtsied when she walked by, and the men still tipped their hats. But eyes lingered longer. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Even the priest avoided her gaze during Sunday Mass. Margaret noticed. Her smile persisted, but her gestures became slower, more deliberate. She began taking long walks through the swamp trail behind her home, her black dress cutting a strange figure among the silver cypress and green shadows. The children said they could hear her humming after sundown, her voice low and sweet, drifting through the trees. Then, one cold January morning, the sheriff arrived at her home with Reverend Dunn. They had a question about the late Mr. Holloway, Margaret's husband, and the circumstances of his death in New Orleans. The Reverend had received a letter from a friend, a retired doctor, who claimed Mr. Holloway's death had been suspiciously peaceful. Poison. That single word turned every assumption upside down. Margaret welcomed them in with grace. She poured tea, smiled as always, and listened to their questions calmly. Outside, the wind carried the sound of the river, constant and distant. When they left an hour later, they had no confession, but something in her composure unsettled even the sheriff. That smile again, too calm, too knowing. Weeks later, Margaret disappeared. Her house stood empty, table set for two, the teapot still warm. A single glove lay by the door, one she never would have left behind. The swamp search lasted 3 days. They found no trace of her body. But stories lingered long after the search ended. Some claimed she boarded a steamboat bound for St. Louis. Others swore they saw her reflection in the bayou water at dusk. Reverend Dunn retired soon after, his faith shaken. In his final sermon, he simply said, "Evil does not always scream. Sometimes it smiles." And in Belle Meyer, they say that when the night is still and the moon low over the swamp, you can hear a woman humming softly, her song as steady and cold as the river that took her secrets. Margaret Holloway, the widow who smiled while killing, became the quiet legend of Belle Meyer. Her name was whispered for generations, a warning wrapped inside a smile. After Margaret Holloway vanished, Belle Meyer learned what silence truly sounded like. It wasn't the stillness of peace, but the tension of a breath held too long. Doors that once stood open now closed early. Windows were latched before sunset, and the soft chatter that used to fill the general store vanished, like smoke in the winter air. It was as if the town itself feared its own shadow. Months passed, and spring crept slowly back across the bayou. The wildflowers returned, the cane fields brightened, and the scent of magnolia once again danced in the wind. But the Holloway house, set at the edge of the swamp road, framed by drooping moss, remained untouched. Dust gathered on the porch swing. The shutters clattered against the walls when the wind rose. People avoided walking past it. The few who did swore they felt watched. Before her disappearance, the widow's house had been the center of quiet grace, a place where the sick found comfort, where neighbors came for tea and advice. Now it stood like a wound in the town's memory, lingering and unhealed. The sheriff suggested boarding it up. Reverend Dunn, growing frilier by the day, refused. "Let her spirit rest," he said. But rest was something Belle Meyer would not find for years. In midsummer, when the riverboats once again began to pass, a young man named Thomas Reddick arrived from New Orleans. He was 28, tall, polite, and carried himself with the ease of someone used to city air. He told the townsfolk he was a journalist, documenting stories of Louisiana's changing countryside. People welcomed him cautiously, curious but guarded. It wasn't long before he heard the name whispered in the tavern, Margaret Holloway. The tone in which it was spoken was always cautious, the syllables sharp with memory. The widow had left behind more than rumors. She had left fear. Thomas was intrigued. There was something magnetic in the way people spoke about her, as if they knew she was evil, yet could not help but admire her. He rented a small room above the general store. For days, he walked the streets, speaking to whoever would talk. The baker told him she once baked bread for Mrs. Holloway every Tuesday, though she never saw her eat. The midwife remembered her scent, lavender, and something faintly metallic. The sheriff warned Thomas gently not to dig too deep. "We've got the past buried just fine," he said. "Don't be the one to wake it." But Thomas had a journalist's hunger for truth, and truth rarely stayed buried. A week after his arrival, he visited the Holloway house. The air inside was stale, the silence heavy. He noticed the order of the place, nothing overturned, no sign of struggle. A faint scent of tea and perfume lingered, as though she had just left the room. On the mantel, he found a single framed photograph, Margaret and her late husband, James Holloway. She looked radiant, dressed in ivory lace, her hands resting on his arm. Yet what caught Thomas's eye was her expression. Even in that frozen image, her smile was precisely the same one the townsfolk described, gentle, unwavering, detached. A smile that, once seen, lodged itself in memory. He began taking notes, sketching the house's interior. In the bedroom, beside the wardrobe, he discovered a small wooden chest. It wasn't locked. Inside were letters, over a dozen of them, addressed to James Holloway, but never sent. The handwriting was elegant, the sentences poised. But as he read, a quiet intensity grew between the lines. "You've given me everything," one letter read, "and yet you stand between me and what I truly desire, peace." Another ended abruptly, the ink smeared as though written through tears or anger. "You made me promise to be your salvation. I think now I can only be your end." He closed the box, unsettled but fascinated. Here was a woman who spoke both as victim and executioner. Thomas recorded every observation, convinced that her story would reveal something larger, a study in charm, control, and the hidden violence of the genteel South. But his interest soon shifted from curiosity to obsession. Over the following weeks, he visited the house each afternoon, jotting notes, mapping every object she left behind. The sound of the swamp became his constant companion, the slow murmur of water, the sigh of wind through reeds. Yet sometimes, when he sat alone at her parlor desk, he could swear he heard faint humming. It came from nowhere in particular, soft as a lullaby. The townsfolk began to notice his growing fixation. "You're chasing smoke," the sheriff told him one evening outside the tavern. "The dead don't like being remembered down here." Thomas smiled, said nothing, and returned to his notes. By autumn, his manuscript was nearly finished. He titled it The Widow and the Water. It was part biography, part speculation, an attempt to understand the mind of a woman who could charm a town while slowly killing it. But before he could send it to his editor in New Orleans, something changed. The document disappeared from his room, every page gone, his handwriting obliterated as if it had never been. That night, the townspeople reported seeing a light flickering inside the Holloway house. The porch lantern glowed, a soft, yellow pulse against the black marsh. Several men gathered the courage to investigate. When they pushed the door open, they found Thomas Reddick seated at the parlor desk, head resting on folded arms, the faint scent of tea in the air. The cup beside him was half empty. His expression was calm, and on his lips, the ghost of a smile. No one spoke of it openly, but the sheriff's report said only one thing: no signs of violence. Death by unknown cause. Expression serene. After the burial, Reverend Dunn, older now, fragile and pale, visited the house one last time. He stood at the threshold, his cane trembling against the floorboards. "You wanted to be remembered," he whispered into the hollow room. "And you will be." Then he crossed himself, turned, and left for good. Winter came early that year. The river froze at its edges. The fields went barren. The Holloway house stood empty again, but sometimes light flickered faintly from its windows, like breath on glass. And those who passed by on their way to the church swore they heard laughter, not loud, but soft, like a memory replaying itself. By then, Belle Meyer had learned an unsettling truth. Evil doesn't vanish when its vessel disappears. It lingers, reshapes itself, waits in silence. It doesn't haunt, it remembers. And somewhere beyond the bend of the swamp road, where the fog swallowed the trail to the river, a single set of footprints appeared now and then. Small, delicate, unmistakably feminine, leading only one way, toward the water. Margaret Holloway was gone, but her smile, that perfect, haunting curve, remained written in every reflection, every whispered warning shared by mothers to their daughters. Because in Belmire, they learned that sometimes the prettiest faces carry the deepest scars, and the ones who smile the most often hide what they've done best. The winter of 1875 marked the first time the townsfolk of Belmire began to believe the dead were writing back. It started when the postmaster, Henry Claiborne, unlocked his office one fog-heavy morning and found 3 letters waiting on the counter. They hadn't been there when he closed the previous night. He would have sworn to it. The handwriting was ornate, old-fashioned, written in black ink that shimmered faintly even under the dim oil lamp. Each was addressed to a different household, the senders' names carefully penned on the envelopes. Margaret Holloway. The postmaster's hands trembled as he examined them. He knew that name far too well. Her disappearance still haunted the town, made worse by the death of a journalist just months earlier. But curiosity fought with fear, and curiosity won. He delivered the letters quietly, without a word to others. By sundown, the entire town knew. The first went to the Bro family, whose daughter had been among Margaret's first victims years earlier. The letter was brief and chilling in its civility. I hope this finds you in good health. I regret the sorrow I may have caused your household, yet I assure you it was never cruelty, only necessity. The next village received one similar in tone, signed in her exact handwriting, elegant as lace, final as judgment. It thanked the recipient for their kindness during her stay in Belmire, then added one strange request: keep the lamp burning at the edge of your porch. I am nearer than you imagine. Fear spread like smoke. The sheriff declared the letters a cruel prank. But even he couldn't explain the third one, delivered to Reverend Dunn himself. His arrived late one night. He found it resting on the windowsill inside his rectory, the portrait of the Sacred Heart flickering in the candlelight beside it. When he read the first line, his breath caught. You were right to doubt me. Faith has many faces, Reverend. Mine simply smiled while yours trembled. He sat in silence for hours after finishing it, staring at those words. When the church bell rang at dawn, he didn't move. That Sunday he stood before a half-empty congregation and spoke with a voice no one recognized, the kind that quivered not from age, but fear. We have allowed her memory to become our prayer, he said, and memories can curse as fiercely as sin. No one dared to mention her name after. Not in whispers, not in confession. But as winter thawed and the bayou began to swell again, more letters appeared. One was nailed to the door of the general store. Another slipped beneath the doctor's gate. Some were blank inside. Others carried fragments of phrases written over and over: I am home, or you will see me again. The pattern consumed the town's fragile peace. Crops failed, animals turned sickly, and a fever began to spread along the riverbanks. People said it was bad water. Others said it was her, Margaret, reaching out from wherever she had gone, reclaiming what she left unfinished. In early March, a group of men formed a committee to cleanse the Holloway house once and for all. Among them was Sheriff Beaumont, a few field hands, and young Andrew Bro, the seamstress's nephew. They carried torches, kerosene, and crosses. The moon hung low, and the air smelled of rain. They set fire to it just after midnight. The flames swallowed the wood quickly. The smoke rose thick, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender, the widow's perfume. But before the roof collapsed, someone swore they saw a figure standing in the doorway, slender, motionless, her head tilted with that same ghost of a smile. The next morning, nothing remained but ash and iron nails. Yet the scent lingered for days. Reverend Dunn went silent after that. He stopped preaching, retreated to a small cabin near the river where he spent his final months writing. These writings, the ones later found hidden in his Bible, revealed what he claimed to have discovered from the letters. I read them all, he wrote, and saw a consistency no mimic could replicate. She wrote as though she lived between worlds, not dead, not alive, but waiting for acknowledgement. Each sentence spoke of return, not vengeance. She wanted to be remembered, not forgiven. His final entry read simply, "Faith is believing." But belief is how we invite what was never gone. 2 weeks later, he was found lifeless at his desk, hands folded, a half-written sermon beside him. No cause was ever determined. In the flickering candlelight, his expression was eerily peaceful, serene, almost smiling. After his burial, strange things began happening along the edge of the bayou. Travelers passing through spoke of hearing whispers at night, words carried just above the rustle of the reeds, faint and melodic like a lullaby. The few who followed the sound said it led them to the water's edge, where ripples formed even when the air was still. Some swore they saw initials traced in the mud, M.H. By the summer of that year, Belle Meyer was half empty. Families moved inland, up toward Lafayette and Baton Rouge, chasing safety and reason. Only the stubborn remained, the ones who believed the town could survive its past. But the land itself seemed changed. The swamp crept closer, the roads washed out after every storm, and vines twisted around abandoned fences as if reclaiming what humans had borrowed. Through it all, a single rumor held steady, that the letters hadn't stopped. They simply changed hands. A traveler once claimed to have found one pinned to the door of an inn 2 parishes away, dated 3 months prior. Another surfaced in a churchyard near Vacherie, unsigned but written in the same unmistakable hand. The final known letter appeared 6 years later, hundreds of miles north, in a boarding house in St. Louis. It was found inside a desk drawer by a maid who'd been cleaning after an older woman left unexpectedly. Inside was a single page. It is not death that frightens me, but how forgettable we become once it finds us. Tell Belle Meyer, if you pass that way again, that I never left. The water remembers everything. There was no return address, but the stationery bore a faint watermark, one the townsfolk of Belle Meyer remembered from her parlor desk. After news of this reached Louisiana, those who still lived near the ruins of her house avoided the swamp road altogether. Even the cane harvesters kept their distance, whispering that the ground there stayed wet year-round, no matter how dry the season. Children were told to stay away, but sometimes they came back claiming they'd seen a woman in black by the riverbank, brushing the grass with her fingertips, smiling softly as she disappeared into the mist. The legend of Margaret Holloway grew beyond Belle Meyer in those years. Her name spread across parishes and states, printed in regional newspapers as a reference for madness, deceit, or charm gone wicked. But for those who had truly known her, the few still left to remember, she wasn't just a story. She was a reminder that beneath the lace and etiquette of the Old South, there lived quiet, unflinching cruelty, the kind that kills with a calm heart and a steady hand. And every night, when fog rolled down from the wetlands and the moon hung thin over the river, Belle Meyer seemed to breathe her name again. Margaret Holloway, the widow who smiled while killing, the woman who refused to be forgotten. By the time 1880 arrived, Belle Meyer was more swamp than town. The cane fields had withered, the brick storefronts crumbled under vines. Where laughing children once played, bullfrogs called through the night, and the wooden bridge that crossed the bayou sank deeper into mud with every passing storm. It was as if the land itself had grown tired of memory, tired of pretending that something pure had ever lived there. But the swamp had a way of keeping secrets, and in late August of that year, one rose to the surface. A boy named Elijah Dupre, 13 years old and curious beyond his years, was fishing near the old ferry dock when his line snagged on something heavy. Thinking it a log, he pulled and pulled until a small wooden chest came loose from the water. It was soaked, the hinges rusted, but the lock gave way easily. Inside, beneath layers of damp cloth, lay a collection of letters tied with silk ribbon, brittle, water-stained, and unmistakably written in Margaret Holloway's precise, elegant hand. Elijah, unknowing of the danger his discovery carried, brought the box to town, showing it off to whoever would look. Within hours, the sheriff took possession of it and summoned the few remaining elders of Belle Meyer to his office, among them Mr. Claiborne the postmaster and Anoise Bro, now a frail woman whose gaze still burned beneath wrinkles of age. The sheriff untied the ribbon with steady hands, laying out the letters one by one. The first was dated 1873, a full year before her husband's death. The words inside dripped with emotion, shifting from affection to deep resentment in a single breath. You taught me that marriage is duty, but duty becomes poison when born of lies. Each dawn I wake with your weight upon my chest, and yet I smile, because it is easier to be adored than to be honest. The next letter, written only weeks later, was colder. I watched you take your brandy tonight, unaware of what floated within. You spoke of faith as though it were yours to bestow. Yet faith, I have learned, is simply endurance. And I will endure far beyond you. The room fell silent. The sheriff rubbed his temples, while Anais murmured a prayer under her breath. There was no longer doubt. Margaret Holloway had confessed long before anyone thought to accuse her. But it wasn't just confession that the letters held. They were a record of observation. Detail so meticulous it felt clinical. She wrote of the townspeople, their habits, their weaknesses, their gossip. They see kindness, one note said, because they wish to. All one must do to be trusted is to appear gentle long enough. Another read, they call it faith, but it is fear, fear of what lurks beneath civility. Her handwriting remained consistent to the end, though the tone grew stranger. The last few letters mentioned the water, describing it not with superstition but reverence, as if she believed the swamp itself held her conscience. It listens, she wrote. When I cannot speak my truth aloud, the water answers. It forgives where people will not. I have given it pieces of what I was, so that I may never fully die. The men in the room grew uneasy reading those lines. The swamp had been claiming livestock and even the occasional traveler for years, but this made it sound deliberate, almost personal. The sheriff ordered the letters burned that same evening. The box and its contents were to be destroyed, he said, for the good of what remains. But rumor has a fleet foot, and before the fire consumed them, a local schoolteacher named Mrs. Lemaire copied several pages into her notebook. Those copies would later fuel decades of speculation and more tragedy. One evening, as the fire devoured Margaret's words, thunder rolled across the horizon. Rain began to fall heavily, flooding the low roads, and in that downpour Elijah Dupre, the boy who had found the chest, vanished. His fishing pole was discovered the next morning near the dock, line torn, footprints leading toward the water and stopping abruptly at the edge. The sheriff refused to speak of it publicly, insisting the river had simply claimed another careless child. But whispers began again, as they always did. People swore they'd seen candlelight floating near the site where Elijah disappeared. Not a lantern's glow, but the steady flicker of a woman's silhouette framed in stormlight. Weeks later, Mrs. Lemaire fell ill. Her husband described her fits as feverish and delirious. She muttered about voices in the reeds, and letters rewriting themselves in the dark. When she died, he found her notebook on the bedside table. The ink had run as if soaked from within, yet her final written line remained clear. The swamp is speaking her name. From then on, Belle Meyer surrendered to its decay. The church bell no longer rang. The sheriff's office was abandoned when its caretaker left for Baton Rouge. Houses vanished beneath vines, roads eroded, and slowly, the bayou took the town back 1 acre at a time. But travelers claimed that from afar, when fog thickened along the water, Belle Meyer still shimmered faintly, like a ghost of its former self. In 1901, decades after Margaret's disappearance, a historian from New Orleans, Dr. Henry Tournier, visited the site. He was researching folklore for a university paper and was told the story of the smiling widow. Skeptical yet curious, he ventured deep into the overgrown ruins, guided by an old trapper who still remembered the name Holloway. They came upon what remained of her home, a cluster of bricks, rusted iron, and blackened soil where the fire had burned 20 years earlier. Nearby, they found traces of a garden, or what might have been one, a few surviving roses growing half-wild among thorns. Dr. Tournier knelt to examine a twisted patch of metal, recognizing it as the shape of an old lock hinge. In its center, rusted but legible, were the initials M.H. That night, as they camped by the river, the trapper told him quietly, "You can study ghosts all you want, doctor, but here they study you back." Tournier scoffed, but when dawn came, His journal was wet, though no rain had fallen. Across its last page, in a faint and unmistakably feminine script, someone had written, "Do not pity me. The water remembers." He left Belle Meyer the next morning, abandoning his research. His notes remained unpublished until after his death. When finally released, they reignited the legend for a new generation, a blend of folklore, confession, and unresolved truth. And through it all, one thing stayed constant: the swamp's quiet murmur each evening, as the sun sank and the water turned gold for a heartbeat before fading to black. Some said it was wind, others the shifting reeds. But to those who truly listened, it sounded almost like breath, rising, falling, whispering from beneath the surface. The swamp, it seemed, was finally confessing, not to condemn Margaret Holloway, but to remember her, because the evil she embodied was not foreign to the land. It was born of the same stillness, the same beauty, the same patience hiding beneath every calm reflection. And somewhere between those waters and the sky, her smile lingered still, unbroken, untouched, waiting for someone new to look closely enough to mistake it for kindness once again. Dr. Henry Tournier could not escape the shadow of Belle Meyer. After returning to New Orleans, his colleagues at Tulane said he seemed distant, distracted, and strangely haunted. He spent sleepless nights rereading his own field notes, searching for logic in what he could not explain. The page where the mysterious words had appeared, "Do not pity me. The water remembers," became his private obsession. He tore it from his journal and sealed it in an envelope, convinced that it was some form of condensation, a trick of moisture, not handwriting at all. But deep down he knew better. He had seen too much. Weeks turned into months, and Tournier slowly abandoned his teaching post. He began writing a manuscript titled The Holloway Hypothesis, claiming it would reveal how a woman's cruelty shaped a town's collective delusion. But the more he wrote, the more detached his words became from rational study. It was as if the handwriting itself had entered his mind, elegant, calm, deliberate, suggesting that truth was not something to uncover, but something to inherit. His friends grew concerned. One evening, during a dinner at a professor's home, he suddenly rose mid-conversation and said, "Have you ever stared at a body of water long enough to see your reflection move without you?" The table fell silent. He sat down again as though nothing had happened. 3 nights later, Tournier disappeared. The landlady of his boarding house found his room perfectly arranged, bed made, lamp still burning. On the desk lay a final letter addressed to no one in particular. It read, "I understand her now." The smile was not malice, it was recognition. Water holds no guilt. Beneath the signature, faint but visible, was a second line written in a different hand. "I taught him well." His body was recovered days later near the Mississippi River docks, face serene, eyes half open, the same strange calm that had marked so many who'd followed Margaret Holloway's story too closely. When the news reached St. Louis, where rumors of the widow's letters of the dead had already circulated, a journalist named Clara Beaumont took an interest in the pattern of deaths. She was 26, fiercely intelligent, known for her boldness in a field dominated by men. Clara believed the Holloway myth had grown into a contagion, an idea so powerful it warped reason. She boarded the southbound train to Louisiana, determined to prove it. She arrived in Belle Meyer in late September. What she found was not a town, but a skeleton of one. Swamp grass had swallowed the roads. Only 2 homes remained inhabited. The church doors hung open, filled with birds' nests. It was a place frozen in time, as though the air itself refused to let the past dissolve. Clara took shelter in the old sheriff's cottage, the only building still intact. By oil lamp, she read what few reports survived: the death records, Reverend Dunn's transcriptions, and faded witnesses' notes about a house fire and letters that could write themselves. Yet amid all these documents, she found something none of the earlier visitors had noticed: a ledger belonging to Henry Claiborne, the postmaster who had first handled the mysterious letters in 1875. Inside were details about each letter's paper type, seal shape, and delivery route. They were precise, almost obsessive. One entry caught her attention: letter received on the night of the 14th, seal unbroken, ribbon dry. placed upon the counter by unseen hand, likely draft through window. He had drawn the wax seal next to the note. 2 initials inside an oval border, M.H. Clara stared at the symbol for a long time. It should have been meaningless, yet it felt alive. That night, she dreamed of handwriting, endless flowing lines looping through darkness like roots in water. When she awoke, her palms were damp, as though she had been holding something submerged. Determined to find proof of a natural explanation, she ventured to the ruins of the Holloway property the next morning. The sky was dim, clouds heavy with rain. The ground squished beneath her boots as she followed the remnants of a fence down to a hollow where the foundation stones still marked the house's outline. There, in the quiet hum of frogs and wind, she saw it, an iron hinge half buried in mud, nearly identical to the one Tournier had described. With trembling hands, she pulled it loose. Stamped faintly across the rusted surface were the same letters, M.H. The air shifted. A gust rolled through the trees, and for an instant she swore she smelled lavender. Back at the cottage, she examined the hinge under lamplight. Something gleamed along its edge, a thin line that wasn't rust. She wet a cloth and wiped it clean. Beneath the grime, shallow words had been carved. Write me well. Clara froze. Her pulse quickened, her thoughts blurring into disbelief and dread. The phrase seemed to pulse in her mind as she sat before her typewriter. Almost against her will, she began typing. Margaret Holloway was never buried. The keys clacked faster, her mind distant, as if her fingers wrote what another voice whispered. She typed until dawn, unaware of the growing numbness in her hands. When she stopped, the sky had lightened, and her manuscript was complete. 36 pages detailing the history of Belle Meyer with uncanny precision, mentioning details no one alive could have known. At the bottom of the final page, one line appeared in faint ink separate from her typewritten text. Thank you, Clara. The water remembers. Her scream echoed across the swamp. Days passed. Locals who still lingered near the bayou said they saw a lamp burning in the sheriff's cottage night after night, even as the storms returned and wind whipped through broken shutters. Then, one morning, the light was gone. Searchers found the cottage empty. On the desk lay the pages she had written, edges damp, each word intact. Only one new line had appeared, this one typed though no ribbon remained in the machine. I told you I never left. The manuscript was sent to New Orleans authorities, but soon disappeared from the archives, replaced by blank sheets. Some insisted it had simply faded, the ink reacting to moisture. Others believed the widow's story had claimed another voice, one more mouth through which to keep speaking. From that point on, locals avoided the area altogether. The swamp deepened, swallowing the last traces of the town. But anyone traveling the old Teche River by night reported the same sight, a faint glow among the trees, and the silhouette of a woman standing at the water's edge, watching her reflection ripple, smiling. Clara Beaumont's name joined the others, who came too close to understanding Margaret Holloway. The scholars who mentioned her vanished manuscript agreed on one thing. Every person who tried to document her ended their story the same way, calm, serene, and smiling. The curse of the Holloway woman was not death, but understanding. Because once you saw her clearly, you could never see yourself the same way again. And somewhere beneath the still water of the Louisiana swamp, a single voice whispered to every listener who stopped to breathe, "You are remembering me now." And that is all I ever wanted. By the turn of the century, Belle Meyer had all but vanished from maps. Cartographers left blank spaces where the river split and the swamp bled into cane fields. The last records of habitation dated to 1904, though travelers occasionally wrote of an old parish swallowed by silence. To most, Margaret Holloway was no longer a woman, but a myth, an echo from a forgotten place. But for one man, she remained painfully real. Elias Broussard was 72, the child of one of the last families to leave Belle Meyer before the flood finally consumed the land. His father had been a farmhand who once worked a field near the Holloway property. Elias remembered almost nothing of those years, only the smell of damp soil and the shadow of a woman in black who stood near the willow trees. His mother called her the widow, and refused to speak about her after they moved north to Crowley. For decades, Elias tried to forget, burying memory beneath the routines of labor. But memories, like water, find their way back. In 1915, he returned to what was left of Bellmeyer, spurred by a letter from the State Historical Society asking survivors for testimony. The swamp had thickened since he'd left, its edges swallowing the road like a patient predator. When he arrived, all that remained were scattered foundations, broken fences, and the leaning cross of what had once been the churchyard. The air was heavy, still, and the smell, sweet, decayed, eternal, clung to his clothes. He set up camp near the old ferry crossing, intending to stay one night. But the longer he remained, the more the silence began to sound like speech. Water lapped against the ruined dock in rhythmic patterns. Reeds swayed though no wind stirred them. And in the dusk, he felt a strange sensation, the impression that someone was observing him, calmly, almost kindly. That evening, he sat by his fire and began dictating into his travel journal. "My name is Elias Broussard," he wrote. "I am perhaps the last man alive who knew Bellmeyer when it breathed. They asked me to tell of its people, its end, and of her. But she never ended. That much I know." When night fell completely, fog rolled across the ground like a curtain. From somewhere beyond the trees came the sound of humming, low, familiar, impossibly close. He closed his eyes, feeling it move through the air like a lullaby from another time. Then, faintly, a voice whispered his name. He stood, lantern shaking, and turned toward the sound. A few feet away, where the fog thickened, a silhouette shimmered by the water. A woman in dark fabric, unmoving, face framed by thin curls. Her form was clear, yet her reflection in the water rippled, as if she were floating between worlds. "Mrs. Holloway?" he asked, though his throat barely formed the words. The figure lifted her chin slightly. Even from that distance he could see it, that unmistakable, faint, eternal smile. And then she spoke, her voice calm, without malice. "You remember me," she said. "Then I am not lost." He wanted to run, but something rooted him in place. "Why?" he asked. "Why did you do it?" The sound of the swamp seemed to deepen, as if the land itself leaned closer to hear her answer. She stepped toward him, her feet leaving no mark on the mud. Her tone was gentle, almost conversational. "They wanted a woman who could heal. I gave them one. They needed someone to take their sins. I carried them. I did not kill out of rage, Elias. I killed because I was asked to save, and salvation always hungers." His heart pounded, the flame in his lamp flickering wildly. "That's not saving, that's murder." She paused, tilting her head as the faintest breeze stirred the reeds. "Does it matter what we call mercy, if the result is peace?" Her eyes glimmered, dark, endless, and not cruel, but weary. "I was never what they said I was, but their fear made me whole, and now their memory keeps me alive." He couldn't move as the air grew heavy again. "What do you want?" he whispered. "To be remembered as truth, not myth," she said. "You are the last of them, Elias. You will tell it right." And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. The night swallowed her form, leaving only ripples on the bayou's surface. Elias backed away until his body hit the broken fence post behind him. The humming continued faintly, fading into the hiss of crickets. By morning, the fog had lifted. Sunlight bled through the cypress branches, and the bayou looked ordinary once more, green, placid, deceiving. He forced himself to open his journal again, though his hands trembled. His first line was simple: "I saw her." He wrote for hours, recounting everything: her voice, her words, her expression. But as he neared the end, a strange calm settled over him. His breathing slowed, his pulse softened. In the distance, the same lullaby whispered back through the reeds. He did not resist sleep when it came. When a state researcher arrived weeks later to collect Elias's account, he found the camp still standing. The firewood was reduced to ash, and a journal rested on the folding table. Elias sat in his chair beside it, eyes open, faint smile upon his lips. The last page of his journal bore one new line, written in elegant script unlike his own. "Thank you for remembering." After Elias's death, His journal passed into the archives at Baton Rouge, where it remained sealed for decades. Those who studied it noticed odd details. The ink never faded. The handwriting alternated between two distinct styles, and the margins carried faint water stains resembling fingerprints. When the pages were held to the light, faint indentations appeared beneath the final sentence, as though more words had once been written, then pressed away. No one ever deciphered them. The story of Margaret Holloway became an academic curiosity in the 20th century, referenced in articles about mass hysteria and cultural haunting. But among Louisiana's small river parishes, her name was still spoken in low tones, especially by those whose families had once lived near Belmire. Boatmen swore that, on quiet nights, you could still see a figure on the water's edge, a pale woman staring out where the church spire used to stand. Her face never fully visible, but her smile unmistakable. Some thought the swamp had finally claimed what it birthed. Others believed she had become part of it, not a ghost, but a memory that refused to rest, a witness to everything humans chose to forget. And when the moon rose over that drowned town, shining across the still surface, locals avoided looking too long, for fear they'd see her behind their reflection, smiling patiently, waiting to be remembered. Margaret Holloway was never buried in the soil of Louisiana. She was buried in recollection, eternal, unseen, alive wherever guilt and fascination intertwined. And in every mind that wondered what truly happened at Belmire, her whisper remained constant, soft, almost loving. Remember me kindly, and I will let you forget yourself. By 1925, the Teche River had changed course again, flooding deeper into the ruins of Belmire. What had once been solid ground was now a vast, reflective sheet of water scattered with the tops of drowned cypress trees. To the people who lived miles upriver, the flood was just another stubborn act of nature. But to those who still remembered the stories, it felt like something older had finally awakened. The return of the river, they said, was the widow's final breath. For years, no one dared approach the drowned parish. Yet one late summer, a government survey team arrived to chart the new river boundaries. Among them was James Calhoun, a 29-year-old engineer, methodical and skeptical, whose interest in the assignment came not from superstition, but from science. He'd grown up in Baton Rouge, listening to old-timers whisper about Margaret Holloway, the woman who had smiled while poisoning her neighbors. And though he laughed at ghost stories, he secretly hoped to find something that explained why this particular corner of Louisiana refused to die quietly. The work began at dawn each day. The crew rode through dense fog that clung to the water like breath. Measurements were taken, samples collected, and yet every night the men came back uneasy. Their equipment failed more than once, compasses spun wildly, and one man swore he heard distant singing each time he waded into deeper water. Calhoun recorded everything in his log, always careful to note the hour, direction, and location. He was no believer, but patterns mattered to him, and soon he began noticing one. Each night's strange occurrence centered on a single coordinate, 30°26'N, 91°54'W, approximately where the Holloway house once stood. Calhoun convinced two crewmen to accompany him there one evening after supper. Twilight painted the bayou in violet light, the air still and dense. They paddled quietly, their lanterns faint halos on the surface of the water. When they reached the spot, Calhoun dipped a long pole to measure depth. 8 feet, he said, barely moving water. Yet when he looked down, he could see something beneath the surface, something solid and pale, glimmering faintly as though polished bone. The others refused to linger. By morning, one had packed his things and left for Baton Rouge, muttering about a woman's face under the water. Calhoun stayed, though his sleep grew restless, his dreams filled with slow ripples and the echo of a woman's humming. He began rereading old reports, Dunn's sermons, Claiborne's notes, and the last words of Elias Broussard. The same phrase recurred over and over across the decades. The water remembers. By the third week, water levels rose unexpectedly even though no rain had fallen. Calhoun awoke one night to find his camp half submerged. In the moonlight, the flooded land looked almost like a mirror. He could see his own reflection until it smiled back at him. He froze. The face staring up was his, yet the expression belonged to someone else. Calm, knowing, unblinking. A woman's voice floated from nowhere. "You write her well, Mr. Calhoun." His body went cold. "Who's there?" he shouted, spinning toward the trees. No answer, only the rhythm of gentle waves slapping against the boat. When he looked back, the reflection was gone. The next morning, 2 men from the team found him sitting at the water's edge, drenched, staring vacantly. His field journal lay open beside him, the ink smudged but legible. The last entry read, "The house is beneath us. I heard her say we built the river wrong, that it followed the path of her heart, *. They took him back to New Orleans for treatment, but he never returned to work." Months later, one of his colleagues opened the journal again and noticed something strange. The ink on the final line had bled outward into the paper, forming the faint outline of a smiling mouth. Word spread quickly through town. Soon every boatman traveling the Teche avoided the Widow's Bend, steering wide whenever fog settled thick across the water. They said the river ran slower there, its current bending inward as though drawn by some invisible gravity. Fishermen whispered that sometimes, when nets sank too deep, they came back heavier than expected, not with fish, but with small black ribbons, soaked through and neatly tied. In the years that followed, flooding worsened. The parish line disappeared altogether, claimed fully by the water. Locals began referring to the area simply as the Holloway Basin, and yet on clear nights, when the moon struck the surface just right, people claimed you could still see outlines below, square foundations, a church bell half buried, and the remnants of a garden wall. Some said that if you stared long enough, movement flickered between the shadows as if someone were walking among them, fixing what the flood had broken. A state historian named Lillian Hart visited the basin in 1933 with a film crew. Using slow exposures, they captured the first known photographs of what lay beneath the surface. When the negatives were developed, strange distortions appeared. One frame showed what looked like a blurred silhouette of a woman at the edge of the shot. Her mouth caught mid-laugh, water glistening at her chin. Hart dismissed it publicly as a flaw in the film, but her assistant later confided that she'd burned every print after seeing the full roll. She said it didn't feel like an image, he recalled. It felt like an invitation. That same year, the river overflowed again, erasing the last visible trace of Belle Meyer. Newspapers called it a natural disaster. Locals knew better. Old fishermen said the flood came to wash away curiosity, to pull its own story deeper. Yet sometimes, new visitors still arrived. Poets, historians, thrill-seekers chasing the myth of Louisiana's most elegant murderer. They came by boat, always cautious, drifting over what used to be Main Street. Some claimed they could feel the water throb against the hull, as if a heartbeat pulsed beneath the surface. Others said they heard a voice whispering through the reeds. "You've come to remember. Thank you." Margaret Holloway's legend became her afterlife, spreading outward like the flood that bore her name. Witness by witness, generation by generation, the story shifted, less about what she did and more about how every person who sought to understand her ended up reflecting her. The smile they feared began appearing in recollections, portraits, even dreams. The river didn't just take, it mirrored. By mid-century, locals no longer spoke of Belle Meyer's drowning. They called it the return. Because the water, they said, had not come to destroy the town but to reclaim it, to pull home every secret, every echo, every lie built above its surface. The water was hers now, and through it she spoke. As decades passed and new maps replaced old, the Holloway Basin settled into silence again. But every few years, after heavy rains, strange things resurfaced. Pieces of porcelain, a woman's comb, fragments of letters sealed in glass jars, all bearing initials written in fine black ink. MH archivists tried to preserve them, but the ink faded within hours, leaving only blank paper. And yet the smell of lavender lingered. The river was no longer feared. It was revered, an elegy carved into geography. The widow had become inseparable from the land itself, not a curse, but a reminder. Where there is beauty, there is violence. Where there is charm, there is control. And somewhere beneath the calm glitter of water, Louisiana's most enduring smile waited still, curved and certain, eternal as the flood that carried it. Those brave or foolish, enough to drift close, claimed the same final sight before turning away, a faint ripple breaking the mirror of the water, and beneath it, a face too peaceful to fear, too knowing to forget. It was never about death. It was about remembrance. And the river, faithful as ever, remembered everything. By the time 1950 arrived, Belle Meyer existed only in folklore. Children in Louisiana grew up hearing faint fragments of the story. The beautiful widow, the mysterious river, the town that smiled itself to death. To outsiders, it was just another ghost tale told over porch whiskey. To those who lived along the Teche, it was history written in the water. Generations had passed since the flood that birthed the Holloway Basin. New homes dotted the higher ground, and people rarely spoke the old name aloud. But memory is a stubborn thing. It flows beneath progress, ready to rise whenever curiosity dips its hand too deep. The widow never let herself fade. She became a metaphor in sermons, a warning whispered by grandmothers, an essay topic in local schools. Yet she also became something more, a fascination. Artists painted her likeness. Novels turned her into a Southern icon of tragedy and power. Her smile, calm, graceful, inscrutable, appeared on magazine covers, exhibits, and posters for plays that dared to romanticize her cruelty. And every time her image resurfaced, something strange followed. Letters. Not many, only 1 or 2 a decade, each arriving in different towns along the Gulf. They were always handwritten on pale cream paper, sealed with wax bearing the same oval initials, M.H. The penmanship was unmistakable, old-fashioned, steady, beautiful. The messages were brief and oddly timeless. You have portrayed me well. Thank you for remembering. Or sometimes, truth is not what is buried, but who dares to dig. Most recipients dismissed them as elaborate pranks. Some sold them to collectors. Yet, invariably, misfortune followed. A painter drowned in his studio, found sitting upright before a half-finished portrait of a smiling woman. A playwright was discovered lifeless at his desk, cup of tea still steaming beside him. A novelist vanished from a hotel room in Baton Rouge, leaving behind only a single page from her manuscript. It read, "I feel her watching me write." The police never traced the letter's origin. The wax was consistent with materials available only a century before. The ink, when tested, was composed of iron salts no longer produced. Each letter arrived unposted, left on desks, balconies, or inside locked offices. No fingerprints, no footprints, only the faintest scent of lavender and damp soil. By the 1970s, the Holloway legend had shifted again, from ghost story to cultural symbol. University students analyzed it in folklore classes, journalists reprinted lurid summaries, and documentarians filmed the ruins of the swamp by night, microphones trembling in the wind. One of them, a veteran sound engineer named Paul Harker, recounted something that never left him. During a nighttime recording near the old waterline, he heard words emerging between waves of static. "Tell them I remember." When he played it back later in the studio, the tape snapped. Not long after, state geologists discovered strange movement deep below the basin silt. The waterline pulsed, rising and falling with uncanny rhythm. At first, they attributed it to subterranean springs. But when sonar imaging was introduced in the 1980s, the reflected pattern showed something that twisted explanation. A formation in the bedrock, faintly resembling a human silhouette, arms at her sides, face turned upward, mouth curved ever so slightly. The footage was locked away. Yet despite containment, fascination endured. Tourists began arriving again, lured by curiosity and dread. Boats drifted through the swamp under rented spotlights. Visitors took photos, laughed nervously, tossed coins into the water for luck. Guides warned them not to mock what they didn't understand, for fear the water would remember their laughter. Some listened, others didn't. A few never returned from night excursions, their boats found adrift, lanterns extinguished but still warm. Then came the drought of 1991, a blistering summer that lowered the Teche's level to its lowest in a century. For a brief week, the top of an old brick foundation emerged from the Holloway basin, slick and glistening under the sun. Onlookers gathered at a safe distance. Among the rubble lay something small and glimmering, a ring. When it was retrieved by state workers, they found it carved with initials, worn smooth by time, M.H. The historians catalogued it carefully, yet after being stored in Baton Rouge, it vanished overnight. In its place, archivists found a folded note resting atop an empty velvet box. It read, simply, "Return to the water, where it belongs." No one claimed responsibility. Security footage showed nothing but the faint swing of the archive door, moving as if pushed by a breeze. The case closed quietly, labeled an internal error. By the dawn of the 21st century, the basin was declared a federally protected wetland, its surrounding region uninhabited once more. Those who monitored weather equipment sometimes reported small, inexplicable fluctuations near midnight, minor surges in humidity, traces of perfume, faint ripples with no wind. Environmental scientists laughed them off. The locals didn't. A few old families in the neighboring parish still leave out a candle each October 14th, the date Margaret Holloway first set foot in Belmire, 150 years prior. They say it keeps the water still. They say the candlelight reflects her smile so she won't need to appear herself. But sometimes, when the candles burn too long or the wind dies down completely, reflections distort. The flame trembles. A face flickers just behind it, always quiet, always poised, always smiling. Even now, when scholars speak her name during lectures on collective memory or moral decay, they note how the Holloway story transcended death. She had become her own legend, a reminder that evil, when wrapped in grace, outlives goodness. The swamp no longer speaks, it listens. The people no longer fear her, they study her. And somewhere, that realization makes her smile again. Margaret Holloway's crimes were never solved, her motives never fully known. But her legacy seeped deeper than any investigation could reach. It lived in the cadence of Southern storytelling, the curve of a mysterious grin, and every quiet pause after someone says, "It's just story." Because deep down, everyone who hears her name feels it, that pull, that unease, that subtle reflection staring back. At night, when the Techel lies still and stars hover over the black mirror of water, some claim they can see a faint glimmer far out in the basin. A lantern's glow, a silhouette of a woman drifting just above the surface, her face serene, her hand trailing through ripples that never fade. And those who stay long enough to watch swear they hear her final whisper, carried lightly across the water, equal parts farewell and warning. You remember me, and so I live.
Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.